They thought she was just a medic, small, quiet, harmless. And the new general? He treated her like background noise. Until the day she refused one order. One single order. That's when he snapped, drew his weapon, and fired 5 rounds inside the medical bay while she stood inches from death. What happened right after those shots stopped echoing? Before we take you into the moment that shattered the chain of command and exposed the truth everyone tried to bury, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Because what comes next didn't just shock the base, it changed everything. Morning at Ridgepoint Base always carried a certain tension, but the day the new commander arrived, it felt like the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Dr. Lena Ward noticed at the moment she stepped out of the medical tent, her boots sinking into the reddish dirt as soldiers straightened their posture with a kind of uneasy anticipation. They didn't know him yet, but everyone had already heard enough rumors to feel that something was off. Command changes were common in a conflict zone, yet the atmosphere felt sharper, heavier, as if the ground knew a storm was coming before anyone else did. Lena had served long enough to recognize the difference between firm leadership and the type of authority that demands obedience instead of respect. She'd promised herself she wouldn't judge too quickly, but when General Alistair Kane stepped out of the transport vehicle, every instinct in her body told her this man was not here to serve alongside them. He was here to dominate the space they lived and worked in. His metals gleamed in the sun, but it was the cold stillness in his eyes that made Lena's pulse tighten. He assessed the camp as if searching for weaknesses, not people. When his gaze finally landed on her, she saw no curiosity, no acknowledgement, only calculation, as though he were categorizing her before deciding whether she was useful. Lena offered a polite nod, yet the way he dismissed it with the slightest turn of his head hinted at the imbalance between them. She saved lives, he commanded them. That difference shouldn't have created tension, but somehow it did, lingering in the space between them like a quiet warning. Something told her their paths would collide sooner than anyone expected, and she felt it deeply too. The new protocols were announced less than 24 hours after General Kane assumed command, delivered with an icy calm that made every syllable sting. He gathered the senior staff in the operations tent and handed out a typed document that looked harmless until the words settled in. Medical priority would no longer be based on injury severity. Rank would now dictate who received immediate care when resources ran thin. Dr. Lena Ward felt her stomach tighten as she scanned the page, each line contradicting the principles she lived by. She had treated generals and privates alike, never questioning who deserved help first. The body in front of her determined her actions, not the title pinned to it. She glanced around and saw others struggling to hide their discomfort. Soldiers shifted. Nurses exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted to speak, but Lena knew silence would make her complicit. She stepped forward, aware of every pair of eyes following her, and addressed the general with the steadiness she forced herself to hold. She acknowledged his authority, but explained that medical ethics required triage based on survivability, not hierarchy. Her tone was respectful but clear. For a moment, the tent held its breath. Kane looked at her as if she had challenged the foundation of his identity. He didn't raise his voice. The precision of his response made the air colder. He reminded her that this was his command and insisted discipline depended on visible order. He framed her objection as emotion rather than professionalism, dismissing her reasoning with the ease of someone accustomed to being unopposed. Lena stood her ground, even as tension prickled across the room. She repeated that prioritizing by rank could cost lives unnecessarily, that it placed the appearance of control over the value of human life. The silence that followed was heavier, weighted with unspoken support from those who wished they shared her courage. Kane's expression hardened, and everyone watching understood something irreversible had begun, a quiet battle of principles that would not fade quickly. Yet none of them could predict how far this conflict would eventually spread outward. General Kane wasted no time reminding the camp who held the power. The morning after their first confrontation, Lena arrived at the medical station to find new locks installed on the supply cabinets and a set of regulations taped to the wall like a list of sins waiting to be punished. From now on, every request for anything beyond basic bandages required his personal approval. It didn't matter whether a soldier was bleeding out or fighting infection. Paperwork came first. At first, Lena thought it was a misunderstanding, some bureaucratic formality blown out of proportion. But when she submitted a request for antibiotics for a soldier with a rapidly worsening wound and received a denial stamped in bold red ink, she understood exactly what this was: retaliation disguised as procedure. Inspections followed. Kane would walk into the medical tent unannounced, trailing officers behind him like a procession of judgment. He'd run a finger along a counter, point out insignificant flaws, question decisions that saved lives only hours before. His voice never rose, but the precision of his criticism sliced deeper than shouting ever could. He wanted her to bend, to become another quiet figure in his carefully arranged hierarchy. Instead, she continued doing what she always had, treating whoever needed her most. Word spread quickly among the enlisted soldiers. They watched her stay late after shifts, saw her improvise when supplies were withheld, noticed how she made decisions based on compassion rather than rank. They didn't dare speak loudly about it, but their gratitude showed in smaller ways. A nod as she passed, an extra pair of hands during emergencies, a whispered "thank you" when no officers could hear. She became, without trying, a quiet symbol of the values they wished their leaders upheld. Kane noticed that too. His warnings grew sharper, delivered in halls where the walls seemed to absorb tension. He hinted at reassignment, questioning whether her presence was becoming disruptive. The threat lingered in the air like smoke, meant to force compliance through fear. Yet with each restriction he imposed, each soldier she helped despite the limitations placed on her, the divide widened. Everyone could feel the pressure building, an invisible line stretching thinner each day. And though no one could say when it would finally snap, all of them sensed it coming. The moment when this struggle would no longer stay contained in whispered conversations and silent glances, but erupt into something impossible to ignore. The attack hit just after dusk, catching the outer patrol off guard and sending a cascade of wounded soldiers rushing toward the medical tent. Lena felt her pulse sharpen as she moved into motion, her mind shifting into the focused clarity that had carried her through countless emergencies. 2 soldiers were carried in at once, one a lieutenant with severe head trauma, the other a young private with massive bleeding but a stronger chance of survival if treated immediately. The room spun with shouts, boots pounding the floor, metal trays clattering as the team scrambled to stabilize whoever they could. Lena assessed both men with practiced precision. She knew what General Kane wanted: treat the lieutenant first, no matter the prognosis. But she also knew the truth. Saving the private now meant preserving a life. Delaying him meant losing him. She made her choice without hesitation and directed her team accordingly. The moment she called for instruments, she heard the familiar, chilling cadence of Kane's footsteps entering the tent. His eyes zeroed in on the scene, and a cold fury flickered across his face. He stepped closer, demanding to know why the officer wasn't the priority. His voice sliced through the noise, but Lena didn't flinch. She explained, calmly but firmly, that the private could still be saved, while the lieutenant needed stabilization first. Kane rejected her reasoning instantly, framing it as insubordination rather than medical necessity. He ordered her to step aside. She didn't move. That single moment stretched into something electric, a fragile thread between defiance and explosion. The air thickened. Even the wounded seemed to sense the shift. And then Kane snapped. Without warning, he pulled his sidearm from its holster. Before anyone could register the motion, 5 deafening shots blasted into the ceiling. The sound tore through the room, shaking dust loose from the rafters as every head ducked instinctively. Instruments rattled on metal trays. Someone yelled for cover. A nurse stumbled backward, knocking over a cart. For a heartbeat, it felt like the world had been ripped open. When the echo faded, silence fell, heavy, unnatural, and suffocating. Kane stood in the center of the chaos, chest rising and falling, weapon still raised. His face was a mask of rigid domination, as if the gunshots had been punctuation marks rather than a violent rupture of safety. Lena didn't move. Her hands stayed exactly where they were, steady on the private's wound, her breathing controlled despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Everyone stared at her, waiting to see whether she would yield or break. Instead, she spoke quietly, reminding Kane that discharging a weapon in a medical space put every life at risk. Her voice was steady, almost unreal amid the wreckage of sound. For the first time, Something in Kane's expression faltered, just for a second. But the damage was done. The fragile balance of power had been shattered, and every witness in that room knew there was no going back. When the gunfire settled into memory rather than sound, the camp moved as if awakening from a shared nightmare. Word traveled faster than any official report, rippling through tents and corridors until even the most detached personnel knew something irreversible had happened. Within hours, statements began circulating informally as medics, technicians, and enlisted soldiers recounted what they had witnessed. No one coordinated it, yet everyone seemed to sense that silence would allow the wrong story to take root. Lena remained focused on her patients, answering questions only when approached, offering clear details without embellishment, her calmness anchoring those around her who still felt shaken. By sunrise, a senior officer, Colonel Hartley, arrived from regional command, his expression carved from concern rather than accusation. The moment he stepped into the medical tent, the atmosphere shifted. His presence carried a weight Kane could not suppress, an authority rooted in experience rather than intimidation. Hartley requested private interviews, but even behind closed doors, voices carried just enough for others to sense patterns forming. Witness after witness described not only the gunshots, but the buildup, the withheld supplies, the punitive inspections, the tension Kane wielded like a second weapon. Soldiers who rarely spoke up found their voices steady for the first time in weeks, as if truth itself offered protection. Lena met with the colonel last, not out of strategy, but because she insisted the wounded be stabilized first. When she finally sat across from Hartley, her answers were measured, factual, and free of resentment. She explained her medical decisions exactly as she would in any analysis: prognosis, probability, urgency. Her composure stood in stark contrast to Kane's earlier attempts to frame the incident as a necessary demonstration of authority. Hartley listened without interruption, but she could sense he had already heard enough from others to recognize a pattern he could not ignore. Meanwhile, Kane grew increasingly defensive. He demanded to confront those giving statements, insisting they misunderstood his intentions. He layered justifications upon excuses, each one thinner than the last. The harder he tried to defend the indefensible, the more transparent his desperation became. By mid-afternoon, the camp had shifted emotionally. The fear that once surrounded Kane had evaporated, replaced by a collective clarity about what leadership should look like. And although no one knew the final outcome yet, everyone could feel the narrative turning, guided now by truth rather than intimidation. By the end of the second day, the investigation had gathered enough momentum that even those who once tiptoed around General Kane now walked past him without the old hesitation. The quiet deference he relied on had dissolved, replaced by something steadier, confidence in the truth that had finally surfaced. When Colonel Hartley called a formal assembly, the camp gathered with an energy that felt nothing like curiosity and everything like the need for resolution. Kane stood rigidly near the front, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed as if he could still intimidate the outcome into bending his way. But the room no longer belonged to him. Hartley read the findings with a calm that carried more authority than Kane had ever managed to command, outlining each violation with precision until there was no room left for interpretation. The announcement of Kane's removal struck the room like a cleansing breath. There was no cheer, just a weight lifting, a collective exhale from people who had been holding tension in their bodies for far too long. Kane was escorted out with the formality reserved for someone whose uniform no longer protected him. For the first time since his arrival, the base felt aligned, as though the ground had settled back into place. Lena watched quietly, not with triumph, but with a kind of solemn relief. She hadn't wanted victory. She had wanted safety, clarity, and the chance to practice medicine without compromise. When Hartley later approached her, it wasn't to praise her bravery, but to acknowledge the professionalism that had held the base together when leadership failed. His recognition wasn't loud, and that made it feel more genuine. He informed her that her conduct under pressure would be documented as exemplary, setting a standard for medical integrity across the region. She felt the weight of that, not as a spotlight, but as a responsibility she'd carried all along. Procedures across the base began shifting almost immediately. Supply access was restored without obstacles. Communication between units improved. Soldiers stepped into the medical tent with a renewed sense of trust, reassured that decisions were once again guided by skill rather than hierarchy. The chaos of the previous weeks didn't disappear overnight, but the order returning to the base felt like a long-delayed promise finally being kept. Weeks passed, and Ridgepoint Base began to feel like a place slowly rediscovering its own rhythm. Under new leadership, the routines felt steadier, conversations sounded lighter, and even the morning air seemed to carry a quieter kind of confidence. Lena moved through the medical tent with the same dedication she always had, yet people looked at her differently now, not with awe, but with a grounded respect. She hadn't sought attention, and that made the recognition feel even more genuine whenever someone stopped to thank her quietly. What she had done wasn't about defiance for its own sake. It was about protecting the integrity of her work, the lives in her care, and the principles that shaped every choice she made. The soldiers felt that too, and their renewed trust became one of the quiet victories that mattered most. Some days, a private would stop by just to say he was healing well. Other days, a nurse would mention how much easier it was to work without fear pressing at the edges of every decision. Lena realized that courage wasn't always loud, and it didn't always look like heroism. Sometimes it was simply refusing to let the wrong thing become normal. Her stand had become a reminder that doing what's right often begins as a lonely choice, but it rarely ends that way. People rally around integrity, even if it takes time for them to recognize it. In the end, her courage became the quiet legacy the base embraced fully.